Warren Hutch is my name. I'm the CEO of Ansvar Insurance, and we're an insurance group that specialises in the care sector. We have a separate risk management company as well as an insurance company, so we're very focused on trying to help our clients around risk management. We're very fortunate today to have three sector experts on our panel. Firstly, we've got Professor Joe Ibrahim, who's head of the Health Law and Ageing Research Unit at the Department of Forensic Medicine at Monash University. Joe has many credits to his name, so if you choose to Google Joe or Professor Joe, you'll find out some of the significant stuff that Joe's overseen. We also have Penelope Eden, who's a partner and leads the National Aged Care Practice for Minter Ellison. And Anthony down the end, Anthony Black, is a senior risk consultant with Ansvar, and Anthony oversees the risk management for our care sector. So our intention today is really to have a discussion around some of the key and emerging risks in the sector, particularly from an executive management and a board perspective. And I do mean a discussion. There'll be no death by PowerPoint here, and I would really encourage everyone to raise questions and get involved in the discussion, because in this room we've got a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and information that around the sector and the issues that are facing boards and senior management. And we'd like, if you can share that with everyone, that'd be a great opportunity for all of us to learn as we go forward. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the rising challenges in aged care, as I'm sure many of you will know that, and we are a little bit short on time, but I think through the course of the conversation, the discussion, most of those key issues and risks will come up. So on that note, I might ask Anthony to start with. Anthony, why is the sector so challenged by its governance responsibilities?
So probably preaching to the converted in this room, but as I work through the sector across the country, the feeling around good governance and effective good governance, the challenges with that are tangible. And as I listen to directors and as I work with the industry, and from my experience, I think there's probably three reasons for it, Warren. I think the first one is the complexity of the sector itself. Don't know about you, but I feel like there's been more regulatory change in the last 5 years than the last 15. And it's not just the change, it's the velocity of change and the uncertainty and the complexity that brings. So whilst we're trying to operate a very complex environment in a business as usual way, we're also confronted with enormous regulatory change. I think there are some really wicked risks that we've confronted as well, and we continue to have to confront. And we'll talk about some of those things. I think it'd be good to have a chat with Joe about clinical governance, for example, and some of the risks associated with that. So complexity in its own right is why governance is so challenging at the moment. I think the other thing is the frameworks aren't keeping pace. Listen, let me be honest with you. Part of my work is working with organisations to look at the effectiveness and the capability of their risk management framework. I see frameworks still positioned in something from 10 years ago. I see decisions being made around acquiring, about taking on additional services like complex dementia care in the absence of having good and solid risk management frameworks. And the other part, I think, that makes this all really complex is the culture and mistrust of a sector, not just aged care, but in institutions that we for so long have had so much trust in, like our banks, like our democracy, like our health and hospitals, like our aged care, now our disability care. All the three of those things combining, in my mind, in my experience, are making governance complex. And I guess you'd probably have a view of that too.
Yes, Penny, what are the challenges that you're seeing from your role?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to challenge the sector at the moment, and it's certainly coming across my desk, pretty rapidly at the moment. I think when we talk about governance in aged care, I was reading the Governance Institute of Australia's report around the sector recently in preparing for the session today, and I think they really nicely sort of captured what would be the general themes around what would be challenging for us. They are governance and risk management frameworks that Anthony's just mentioned. I think workforce planning in aged care generally is an absolute challenge, and we've heard about some of that coming through in the media and in the Royal Commission. Regulatory compliance, preaching to the converted, I think, when I talk about that. Financial sustainability is an issue for us at the moment as well. And I think the other key here, we can't talk about governance without talking about non-financial risks in the sector. So I think we're probably at a point of significant inflection in aged care at the moment. I think that there is so many headwinds that we're grappling with. Regulatory compliance, how do we position ourselves for growth? How do we manage and deal with the consumer voice, the culture of our organisation? They're all issues that I'm constantly, discussing with my clients. And I guess, we're currently in the midst of a Royal Commission into Aged Care Safety and Quality, so a conversation about governance wouldn't be, we couldn't not talk about the clinical governance frameworks. And I'm a health lawyer by background. I've come out of working in the health sector as well as a clinician, as well as now as a lawyer. And some of the experiences and some of the learnings that health are bringing to this sector, I think, without medicalising our model in a way that doesn't speak to what our consumers want, I think that it's appropriate to look to what we've done in other sectors to learn some of the lessons there.
Thanks, Penny. And Joe, perhaps from your perspective, and particularly with focus on clinical risk and other things?
Yes, so I've had to think about, I guess, the sector as a whole, and I'm rather simplistic in my thinking and sort of a conspiracy theorist. And most people want someone's head on a block when something goes wrong. And these days, the head on the block is going to be the Board of Governance. And the reason I say that is there's been a long history on corporate deviance. I don't know how many of you know about the Ford Pinto case from the 70s, where Ford chose to run with a car that exploded and killed people because the costs of fixing it were more expensive than paying the liability. So from the 1960s, there's been a long history about how organisations can run, how they can run well. That's been adopted in business and been adopted in health. It's not yet been adopted in aged care. So issues around a learning just culture, which is driven from the board about setting the precedent about how you want the organisation to operate. People aren't concerned anymore to the same extent about fiscal responsibility or the building. People now want to know that the person that occupies your residence, because if you own it, or you're running it, they're your resident, they're your responsibility, be it ethically, morally or legally, they're your responsibility. And what we see with the Four Corners is that criminal activity still comes to you to be answerable to. So assaulting residents, staff assaulting residents is a matter for the board. The health care that residents receive, and this is a really vexed question because the healthcare is delivered by people outside of your control or scope of practice. But anyone that's connected with ISO will know that you have ways to make other providers of services linked in or have a scope of practice, or you need a way to monitor people even if they're not direct line reports. And then the biggest change, and I think that it's most remarkable from a doctor really, is the issue of respecting human rights. So as doctors, we tend to do what we think is best and everyone should listen to what we say. The whole movement to human rights and the resident gets to choose what they want is not novel nor new, because everyone else in the world chose what they wanted to do with their life. And we finally caught up that residents in aged care now have the same human rights that everyone else has had. And the dignity of risk question about living your life in a way that you might harm yourself from doing something that's pleasurable has been in the Act since 1997. So the question I reflect back is, if it's been there since 1997, we're 21 years down the track and now we're worried about how we're going to implement it, which is then a reflection about how the government, the department and the regulatory agencies have now put it into the new standards and have highlighted it. So to me as an academic, I don't see that there's any excuse or plausible explanation for why these aren't happening now. And I think all of this goes back to, would I be a member of a board at the moment? Personally, I'd try and avoid it. It's a really complicated time for it. But if you want to do something good now's really the opportunity to change the face of aged care, and for us collectively to say the problem sits partly with us, but sits outside of aged care. So what is the health department doing about the doctors visiting and providing good care? What is the education department doing about training a workforce that wants to work? What is immigration doing around licensing or visas for people to work in the sector if that's what they want? We have held the problem too close to ourselves, and people have left it with us, and it's really the whole country's problem. I can keep going, but I best...
Joe, no, that's excellent, Joe. Maybe if we just pause there, because I'd like to see, is there, on the things that we've covered so far, is there any questions from the audience or any observations, comments? Thank you.
Paul English from Baptist Care. The question of dignity of risk, which you covered, Professor Ibrahim, sits very well with most people and most operators. Where the challenge actually comes into play is how it's actually perceived, not only by the now the Commission, but certainly having on stage someone involved in risk and someone involved in the legal side. How the intersection of dignity of risk and duty of care. What sort of guidance do you provide in terms of being able to deal with that sort of situation, given what Professor Ibrahim has said regarding dignity of risk?
Well, as a risk advisor, I'm going to first revert to the lawyer.
It's a really interesting issue, and I won't say it's a vexed issue, because we actually have to provide some solutions. And it's something that Joe and I have talked about, and I've actually shared some of the lived examples that I'm, managing day in, day out. And I was reading the standards, the new quality framework, and this embedded notion, which we know has been there since '97 in the legislation. The fact that you age, you don't lose your autonomy and your ability to make decisions for yourself. It might change over time, but this piece around, respecting autonomy and so on. And I've got many, many examples that I can share with you. How do you navigate that? That's your question. You navigate that, I think, from a risk management perspective. So that is really what it comes down to. And I'm not passing the buck back to Anthony to answer the question. It's a bit like informed consent. I remember when we started talking about informed consent in the health space, and doctors said to me, oh, it's too hard. We can't possibly spend all that time second guessing what we think our patients want to know. Here's what I tell them. It's this medical paternalism that Joe alluded to, I think, in his piece before. It's a communication process at its heart. It's spending time with people to understand what's important to them, and this feeds back to culture. And it's something that's, I think, it's going to feature very heavily in the Royal Commission. It's featured heavily in Hayne, in the Financial Services Royal Commission, and it's going to continue to be a theme, not just for Royal Commissions, but for us, operationally. It's at the heart of the social contract that we have with our clients. So for me, I would be saying to you, if you were calling me and asking me, how do we navigate this? I think it's particular to each individual. I think it's about having the conversations, having an open dialogue, involving family and other stakeholders in how you navigate that. It's about that old chestnut of documentation, which I know we all, say we haven't got time for, but it's absolutely necessary to evidence what you're doing about bringing people along on the journey. So I think it is absolutely a challenge. And what makes it even more challenging, I think, is that you're not just dealing with the Aged Care Act. Like, I've got a matter at the moment where it's solely about this dignity of choice and dignity of risk issue. The WorkSafe regulator has jumped on my client. They are being prosecuted in relation to a matter where someone wanted to go for a walk and chose to do that in circumstances where the resident had declining cognition, had mobility issues. So it is a challenge we have to navigate, but you've got to take it on, I think, is probably where it lands. We can't say, oh, this is too hard, We have to be able to engage in a meaningful way in the conversation.
Which I firmly agree with everything you've said. And I think the biggest risk that confronts dignity of risk as part of the culture is that it's not going to be led by boards and executives. So if it's reverting back to clinicians need to manage this, or the care workers need to manage this, or our allied staff need to manage this, that's the biggest risk. It needs to start with the objective of dignity of risk. What is its purpose? Why would we even take this on other than the fact that it's in the Aged Care Act? What is the value of this from a board perspective in having this as part of our culture? And then what is the uncertainty to achieving that objective? What is it in our environment that will stop us from achieving that objective, which is ultimately your risk management process in action? Having a look at building the capability and the understanding of your staff, making sure it's reflected in your policies, in your guidance, making sure as a board that you're getting independent advice about how well implemented dignity of risk is in your organisation and what are some of the failures and opportunities we see as a consequence of implementing it. But like all social reform, which is what this is all about ultimately, it will take time, but it will take a requirement for boards to have these conversations. Traffic light systems are not going to tell you about how effective dignity of risk is operating in your environment. And that foreshadows a completely different way about how we go about getting access to information, particularly at the board and executive table, about the performance of our organisation and how expectations are met.
So can it?
Yes, go, please.
So I think that there's 3 points I want to make is that dignity of risk is about respecting a person. So full stop. So we all have that right here. If we don't respect a person, then we're in the wrong business. The board has to back it, and it's got to be a core tenet of the board to say we respect the people that we are looking after or in our care. Because if the board's not going to back anyone, then their staff certainly aren't going to go off on a limb to do something if they're going to be hung out to dry. I've spent the last sort of 5-6 years talking to coroners and other people about it's the regulatory and court systems that need to catch up because I've heard stories around residents wanting to be secure in their own room but then having a non-compliance because the room is locked from the inside. Yeah, so we haven't caught up there. But if we fold on that, nothing's going to change. The other point is that our duty of care, and this is where I come back, my duty of care as a doctor when I'm taught at university is do no harm. Duty of care is far greater than not hurting someone by doing something. The duty of care now really extends to, do I respect your human rights? And if I don't respect your human rights, then I am harming you, and I have a duty of care not to do that. So I think our definition of duty of care is far too narrow. The final point I want to make is, which the Royal Commission I think has struggled with, is this issue of safety. And people say, well, people need to be safe. And if you look at quality, the definition of quality, safe care is that we don't hurt you with the care that we deliver. The health doesn't say we are going to keep you safe. It just says we're not going to give you dangerous treatments that hurt you. A personal sense of safety is very different to the family sense of you're going to keep mum safe. And when the family say keep mum safe, they mean nothing is ever to happen to her, which is a nonsense. A person's feeling of safety is very different. And people may feel safer if they know they have choice and people are listening to them and they're taking risks. And that's not intuitive. But if I have confidence in the people looking after me, I know they respect me. How do I know they respect me? They let me make my own decisions, and they let me or help me make decisions that are put into action that they might disagree with. Then I trust someone. But someone who just goes along is not someone I necessarily trust. That then gives me a personal sense of safety and social inclusion. So we are confusing the word safe very, very badly. And I think you need to be asking the question, when someone asks you about, are you keeping someone safe, do you mean that we are delivering care in a safe way? Because you can answer that question, but I can never keep anyone safe.
That leads on to, sorry, did you have
I'm just going to say, you're right, Joe, there is a disconnect though, I think, with how regulators see that. There's this sort of paternalistic view, which you talk of the catch-up that needs to happen, and I endorse that, you know, that these people are vulnerable, which we know they are to a degree, but they're also people that have transacted property, that have run businesses, that have, raised a family and done things. So by the time they get into residential aged care, obviously they're in a situation where cognition might be declining, that they do need assistance and so on. But the regulators come to this, I think, with a paternalistic view that we need to protect people as a starting point. And that's where I think it challenges operators in the sector as well, to actually then fully operationalise the idea of and the notion that underpins dignity of risk.
I'd like to touch on culture, if I may, and the panel's view of the role of the board in leading culture within the organisation.
So can I challenge that also with, and I was having a chat with you, Penny, I think last week, testing this. There's an expectation in the new standards, in Standard 8, around the composition of board and their capability. And it actually gets to the point where, have you read this? That it says that the board must be capable for governing for vulnerable people. So I think there's a couple of things in that standard that sends a message that, yes, you must be able to lead the culture, but you must be able to lead a culture that's capable of governing for vulnerable people. And I was thinking, Penny, has anything emerged in, maybe from a legal perspective or just from your governance advisory, where that's been tested? What is governing for vulnerable people, and how do we make sure that boards are composed appropriately? Yeah,
well, certainly, I think fundamental to what we're talking about today is examining skill sets that are coming to boards to make sure that we're bringing the right skill mix, I think, absolutely. But this piece around culture, if we look at what's come out of Hayne, it was absolutely key. The findings in the Hayne Royal Commission were absolutely 5.6 focused on the culture of the organisation. And, there's a lot of learnings that I think can come out of there in the social services sector, which is where we're operating, around how we test our culture. Are we an organisation that is prepared to open our book and really examine the way we're delivering services, to really test whether what we're providing is still fit for purpose? And I think that's probably a key part of the culture in aged care, and I think particularly at the moment.
So I think in terms of culture, because I'm from Victoria, always reflect on the AFL. And you can change the culture of a team with a change in captain, change in coach and 3 or 4 players. And so generational change in a sporting team can occur within 3 years. And so people are often in a hurry thinking, well, can I change the culture quickly? And you can't. In a large organisation, it takes time to turn over. The culture will not change if the board does not walk the talk. And it really needs to come from the board at multiple levels. And again, we go through, there's been substantive research in organisational psychology, in organisational deviance, about how you develop a just culture where you encourage staff to report. And there are cases in Victoria where, and you'd all be aware of it, where a person drowned outside and the body was brought back in and the GP told, we found her dead like this in an organisation. What you need is a reporting culture which you act upon, and sadly we do not have that example from the Department of Health federally. They have not fed back information on serious risk to the sector for our collective learning, but we can't afford to be waiting for government. The other issue around the question of culture more broadly, I've lost the track of this one, so I'll stop.
And I think just to that point about sort of, open, it really speaks to, I think, Joe, open disclosure frameworks, yes, which is something we've done in healthcare for a while now. Talking about what's gone wrong, examining why it's gone wrong, not being afraid to say, we are so sorry this has happened to you. Look at what's happened in Christchurch. Look at the media that Jacinta Ardern is getting, because she is being an authentic leader. She is saying, this is devastating. This is what people want to hear. They want authentic leadership.
And and I've come back to my third point, which is, so I gave expert evidence at the Oakden inquest last year. And one of the points I tried to make across was I did not understand how the Board of Governance and how the State Department was unaware of incidents, or why they didn't have a system, given that the whole strategy was to cohort highly dependent residents with significant behavioural issues, and then everyone is surprised when something happens. And so that, to me, I didn't make that point clearly enough because it didn't anchor. But if anyone was to go in to review an aged care facility today and you do not have strategies for these things around dignity of risk, around resident aggression, around reporting sexual assault and how to manage them, no one can say, this is a surprise, I never saw this coming. And nor can you say we're unprepared, because you know how old the residents are, you know they have dementia, you know the strength and limitations of the workforce that you have, so you already know what the risks there are, and for anyone to be surprised when something goes wrong is no defence. And you know, the question is, have you looked at the organisation from a risk point of view, both clinical, human rights, and again, I think from the criminal element of neglect, abuse, because these things are there, our team's documented there, it's undeniable. We can't plead ignorance anymore. And so we're really after stages, what do we do to demonstrate we're trying to rectify it? And I think, as Anthony said, no one has there's no magic bullet. This is really just hard work with goodwill and commitment. And if we demonstrate that, mostly the world forgives you. They never forgive you for playing dumb.
That leads me to another point around data and information that boards require. So are we seeing then, with all these changes, that there's now a need for different types of information to be escalated to the boards?
Well, I reflect on the quality indicator work that's been established for quite some time now, and how organisations have chosen to submit it. You won't have a choice coming July, I think, but up to this point, 8 to 10% of organisations across Australia have chosen to submit formally that information. That's not to say the 90% aren't using data, but it does signal that we are grappling with what is really important. One of the most common questions I get from board directors or comments is that it's sometimes really difficult to know what questions to ask. We get fed a lot of information, but sometimes that data isn't useful in terms of the information I need. And we do need to start looking and taking a much stronger risk-based approach to what information comes to decision makers. Joe, you might like to talk about the quality indicator work.
So I did my PhD on quality indicators with the hope that doctors would be able to manage performance measurement in hospitals. And then I moved to, you need legislation to make doctors behave, because information, you do, in the end, you do need a big stick often, because people won't do things unless there's some other motivation. And information of itself does not change behaviour. So I was very disappointed that's the end result of my career. The quality indicators are really good if you like maths. They're interesting, but in terms of, so Victoria have had 5 indicators since the mid-2000s, and the idea when we started with those, we started with 20 and we trialled 5 with the hope that we would get to 20. We haven't got to 20. The federal department picked off the Victorian indicators and thought they would go with 2, maybe 3, and it's been voluntary, and now it's compulsory. And the question is, why is it compulsory? Has it demonstrated its worth? The one question I think you can always ask at a board level is, so what you're telling me is X, explain how this makes the life of our resident better. That is the only question. And if your staff can't answer that question, then what is the point of collecting that data? And it really comes back to, how does this data help us? How does this data tell us the resident is having a better life?
I think that's excellent. I've just been told we've only got now 4 minutes left, so we might just then get a quick synopsis from or a recommendation for a next step forward. So, Joe, was there anything that you'd like to add just in the last closing 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll go to Penny and then maybe finish with Anthony.
I think we need to be more assertive. I was going to say aggressive because I always compare ourselves to surgeons, but I think we need to be far more assertive about who owns the whole problem for the country, and to be clear that we cannot solve the aged care issue as a group in aged care, because every part of society intersects with what we do, and everyone else has gotten off pretty much scot-free to date, and we hold the baby. And so when something goes wrong, everyone's really easy to point to us to say we're at fault. We could be far better advocates. We need to engage people far more. And I think we have to include whole of government, so all of the portfolios, not just the aged care one, to get things done. And we've got to be banging on the doors of the Minister for Education, for Health, to do the things that they tell us to do that we can't, because where are the courses to train nurses in care of the older person? How are you supposed to do that if the Education Ministry isn't going to do it?
Thanks, Joe. Penny, closing point.
Yeah, no, I think that as a sector, and it's not dissimilar to health in this regard, that you focus on, there is a tendency to focus on minimum standards. And I see this as a real opportunity to leapfrog the sector, to look to really, have an honest conversation with your organisation, with your boards, about your social licence to operate, your purpose, your why. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? Yeah. And how can we do it better? And to really challenge your thinking. And it goes back to the whole piece about culture. And culture starts at the top, but it's embedded through your organisation operationally as well. And to really think about what it is at this pivot point for the sector that's going to make the difference, and how you're going to,
So I think you've got about 30 seconds, Anthony. So
sorry.
Sorry. This is what I want. More conversations about good governance and what is good governance. I want you to question whether you have apathetic risk management, and I can tell you what that looks like. I won't have the time to be able to talk to you about that today, but can I just say that the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report talked about the fourth industrial revolution, that we're entering an age of perpetual disruption. Is that not the case in aged care? Absolutely. Are we sleepwalking into the age of perpetual disruption? When's the last time you looked at your risk management framework seriously and got advice on it and made sure that we've set a framework about our future? Not a framework that talks about how the old aged care system used to operate, and how can we go about maximising the benefits of risk management. If your risk management isn't helping you to make better decisions, to achieve your objectives, to improve your performance, to make you more resilient, then it's not working for you. You're working for it. You've become a slave to old-fashioned traditional risk management.
please thank our panel.